Welcome to READ, the Research, Education, and Advocacy podcast. READ connects you with leaders, researchers, and educators on their thoughts and insights on education and child development. I always say that intro every time differently, but here we're going to go with that one. As you can see, Jamie is here for another Lead on READ episode where we just spoke with Kelly Carvajal Hagemen. What were your insights, thoughts?
It was a great conversation. You know, I think it's so interesting to see district leaders who are actually putting some really great work in the face of like some really, really difficult odds, right? I think one of the things that I find so like inspiring is to be able to move change in a big system with so much red tape, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's a bureaucracy to manage in public education. Not that there's not one in independent schools, don't get me wrong. But I do think in public education, you have so much more red tape that you've got to work through, and figuring out how to navigate all that and bring all the players together is really, really a challenge. And so I just appreciate her willingness to kind of jump in, reflection on the team she had at the district that she was at when she made some of those big changes and worked with the superintendent and the principals to really, I think, impact some kids in a really great way, and how like shifting demographics, I think, in the town had sort of caused some of those difficulties to begin with. But it's, great story.
Yeah.
Great story.
And for our readers who don't know about Kelly, Kelly was the Director of Curriculum and Instruction at Seaford Public Schools in Delaware. We'll have her story linked from the article she actually wrote on the 74 million. How they went from one of the worst of the state to increase. I even have my notes here. Between 2015 and 2019, 3rd through 8th grade ELA proficiency increased by 18%. And during the same period, mathematics proficiency increased by 20%. And so we'll talk a lot about school culture and change management, which is a key part of our Lead on READ conversations.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so buckle up, readers. You're going to learn a lot from Kelly, learn a lot from us. Enjoy the episode.
Thank you.
Thank you. Kelly Carvajal Hagemen, welcome to the READ podcast.
Well, thanks. Thank you for inviting me. I really just have so much gratitude, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. You are the 6th guest on our special Lead on READ series, where we interview leaders in this space, tackling change management, really focusing on what it means to deliver a really high quality instructional program in the science of reading and instruction to support that, and education and beyond. And so we're thrilled to have you here. We always start every podcast episode with where are you in the world? We want to invite you into our makeshift podcasting living room space. And so we want to know where you are and how you're showing up to this conversation.
All right. Well, I'm in Delaware. And a lot of people say Delaware because unless you are specifically going to Delaware, you don't really have a reason to come down where we are, specifically in the southern part of Delaware, which is extremely rural, agricultural, but also coastal. So down in the southern part in Sussex County, we're known as slower, lower Delaware. And the people from surrounding cities come to enjoy the beaches, but the locals are pretty isolated. The nice thing is that we're about 2 hours from multiple major cities. So that's really nice. We can get to DC, Baltimore, Philadelphia fairly quickly. But we're still, having the everyday access to all of the things that cities offer it has a big impact in, the day-to-day life. And actually, the reason I'm mentioning it is because it has a lot of impact on schools as well.
Yeah.
So I previously, being from Connecticut, when I first moved here 20 years ago, I was in quite the culture shock. And that also had a really big impact on like my beliefs about equity. Mm-hmm. And equitable access to schools and education. A lot of times people really look at that through a lens of demographics or socioeconomics, and they have a big part, but it's also geography that can have a really big part on equity and access. So that's something that's really had an impact on my kind of vision as a leader. Meanwhile, yes, I'm here in my office. I work for the Milford School District. I'm the chief academic officer here, and I really love it.
Nice. Thank you so much. As a leader, one of the things I love to kind of get a sense of is folks' kind of journey in their leadership kind of development. Some of us in working in schools, we get the old tap on the shoulder, hey, it's time for you to maybe kind of take a step forward and kind of move up a little bit. Or sometimes, we wait often for someone to do that, but occasionally people will step into that space and kind of feel like they're ready for that. I'd love to get a little bit of sense of your journey because you, as I understand, you were a classroom teacher and moving through the process of kind of moving up in a district and becoming from curriculum director, now chief academic officer. Talk about sort of what inspired you to go into leadership in schools in this way.
Well, I would say that the first inspiration came when I was a young child. And let me say, I never thought I was going to be an educator.
Yeah.
But I really thought I was going to be like Indiana Jones, and I wanted to save the world and travel. I was really nerdy and into languages. I took 3 different languages in high school. I really loved it. I went to college and I studied Spanish. I decided to hone in on that because I figured that was probably the most useful. And I'm bicultural. My father's side of the family is Colombian. And I think, now that I'm older and looking back on it, I think it was part of me wanting to like reclaim that Latina part of my life because so often people don't see it in my face or, and all of that, and I don't speak English with an accent. So I wanted to like grasp onto that. So, but then I kind of fell into teaching and I realized that I could change the world in other ways. So I started to recognize in school, there's so many linguistically diverse people who are minimized and overlooked because they speak English with an accent or they're learning English. And so I got really clued into those subtractive practices that are used in education that really kind of reduce the assets that students come with, and children come to school and they're not blank slates. They bring all of their background knowledge and their assets, and we have we have an obligation to recognize where they are and then build upon it. And so I started in high school, in college. I went to University of Connecticut and I started my career in Hartford at a bilingual school, Maria Sanchez Elementary, and I taught in first grade. And after 1 year, that was not for me. So I moved on to another school that was called the Metropolitan Learning Center that was outside of Hartford. I worked there. Then I came to Delaware where I taught in a high school. And I was very fortunate to be inspired by some really strong leaders. But I also observed some leaders that weren't inspiring and that they really motivated me to want to make change. And because I saw that there were missed opportunities for children to learn, and I wanted to kind of open that up and reveal that. And that was really what motivated me, is the opportunities that were overlooked in education. So
I think so often we think about those kind of really strong models of leadership and looking to those folks for how to do the work. But I also think you can learn so much by reflecting on what didn't go well or what people where maybe some shortcomings were. I know in my personal journey, I think there's been a lot of moments where I'm like, wow, that's an interesting way to do that. I'm not sure I would ever want to do that. So, let me just tuck that in for another day, learn a little bit vicariously through someone else's error and then move forward a little bit. So, but I really appreciate that. I also really appreciate this sort of intersection with, from an educational standpoint, the bilingual component. and the idea of your love of languages and how you have actually kind of like translated that. Well, you may not be digging up the tomb of Tutankhamun or fighting some bad guys with a whip and your little fedora.
I'm closing my
Like
eyes and
in the
picturing that,
Indiana
though.
Jones, but like you're actually out there on the front lines of education, really kind of pushing this work forward in such a big way. So kudos to you for that.
Yeah, and I think to add to what Jamie had talked about, I in hearing your story, it resonated with me in seeing this intersection between building strong cultures, understanding the strengths of the students and the faculty and the other leaders, that what they bring to the table, their experiences. I love what you talked about, which students come in without a blank slate. Mm-hmm. They have so much to offer. And so you're bridging this push for strong culture, for equitable culture, with the steadfast commitment to bringing better learning outcomes. So I really like that intersection between culture and learning. I want to dig deeper. You talked about the Title III improvement plan. Jamie and I were inspired to read your article in the 74 million that told the story of Seaford's astounding growth in reading outcomes. And I think we just want to set the scene first, right? So at the time in the article, it said that Seaford was the last in the state in terms of literacy outcomes and on the verge of state takeover. And so, A, I think I want to know more about what were some of the challenges that the district was facing, and B, what does state takeover mean in Delaware? Because I know in some other state jurisdictions, that terminology might mean a little different to some folks. So can you set the stage and the scene for us for that?
For sure. Yeah. So, well, I mentioned the Title III improvement plan, mm-hmm. which was specific for English learners.
Okay.
But it wasn't that. It wasn't only that. Mm-hmm. We were on an improvement plan for everything.
Mm.
Literacy scores were in the tank, as were the math scores. The achievement gaps were just getting bigger and bigger. And it wasn't just the vulnerable populations that were experiencing these gaps. Every single student was underachieving. We were on an improvement for our Title I programs. We were in improvement for IDEA with, disproportionality for our, students with IEPs. We were over-identifying students for disabilities. I mean, it was many deep systematic problems, mm-hmm. and there were so many issues, but there was a common thread. I really, now having reflected on all of the work, and that was that the beliefs, there were a lot of really negative beliefs happening in the school district during that time. Everyone was looking for someone to blame. Mm-hmm. And everyone was looking for someone else to fix it, right? You take these kids and go do some intervention and fix it. Mm-hmm. Those kids, like, they can't be in the regular classroom because they're too disruptive. So they need to go somewhere else and get fixed. That kind of mentality. Yeah. So these beliefs were, that students couldn't do it. And they didn't believe the students were capable of learning. Mm-hmm. And, this manifested in lots of ways, as I mentioned, high incidences of discipline referrals and a general, low rigor in all classrooms, right? There was a belief that the families mm-hmm. of the children didn't care. Mm-hmm. And so there was no kind of collaboration really with families. And I'm generalizing. This is not every single person, but in general, mm-hmm. teachers didn't believe that they had the skills nor the resources to teach the kids. And what was the saddest is that the community didn't believe that the schools were able to get the job done. So mm-hmm. we had a lot of families in the district who were choosing to take their children to other school districts, private schools. There's a lot of school choice in Delaware.
Yeah. Okay.
And so they really leveraged that, which was extremely sad. So all of these things were happening at the same time, and we had to work through it. Mm-hmm. We were lucky enough to have gotten a new superintendent who dug his heels in to start making change.
Mm.
Let's see. You asked me a second question about state takeover.
Yeah.
All right. So essentially in Delaware, that means that school districts are monitored extremely closely. So, and not only are you monitored with many, many meetings with the Department of Education, every month an entire team would come and sit down with us for hours and ask us and grill us as to what we were doing and what were the results and how were we monitoring things. But they also wanted us to write lots of plans. We had a plan for everything. And the Department of Ed gave us templates that we had to use for these plans. And sometimes from the different work groups in the department, and I feel terrible to say this, but sometimes they had contradictory plans, and sometimes we had to provide the same data in lots of different ways because the particular work group had their specific way that they wanted to see it. And what that resulted in was a lot of wasted time. And that was extremely frustrating. They brought in lots of external organizations to help us monitor. Those were called supports. But what that meant is that we had to then, take them around, and those were some barriers to doing the real work. Mm-hmm. And like I said, we had a new superintendent, Mr. David Parrington, and my boss at the time, Dr. Corey Miklas, and our board president, who stood up to the Delaware Department of Education. They went to meetings, they advocated, and they were not afraid to go toe-to-toe. They were not afraid to say no and put their foot down and say, no, we're not going to do and write the same plan over and over again. No, we don't need X number of external consultants. We need a couple of really great things, and we need to keep working on it. I'm so thankful to have learned from them and have a superintendent that had that kind of guts.
Yeah.
To put it plainly, he wasn't afraid. Many times I think that the political part of a superintendency makes it almost impossible, but frankly, he didn't care. He wanted to see Seaford better, and he was very tied or very entrenched in that book, Going from Good to Great.
Oh yeah.
Oh, we love
It's a
that
great book.
Yep.
Was there any kind of funding strings associated or pulling of funding associated with the idea of potentially having some kind of state takeover?
Oh, yes. Yes. There was always that fear of, with the state takeover, that we would lose federal funds, or that our funding, we would be more restricted in how we could use the funds.
Yeah.
And so that was a really big consideration throughout the entire thing. So when you're under improvement, they award you funds, they're school improvement funds that have a lot of strings attached. So there was funding to support it, but then that is why the department is able to come in, or, it's under that guise that they are there to help support you and help you make good choices about how to use those funds. But if you're not able to demonstrate improvement, there's always that threat that the funds can go away. And at that point in time, I will say that Seaford had been under improvement so long. At the state of Delaware, they called them focus schools. Mm-hmm. So Seaford had Focus Plus schools because they had to have a different term because we were under improvement so long.
So they go from maybe looking at you through a telescope to a microscope,
Yes.
That Focus Plus, you're zooming in. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really intense.
I know, my gosh. Well, now I'm thinking it sounds like from what you were talking about, you had some folks and a team that were incredibly courageous, that knew exactly what the school, I mean, not knew exactly, but were willing to put their foot down and say, okay, here's the few things that we can do to improve. Here's where we're going to continue to practice and put our efforts in. And it sounds like, again, there was a school-wide team that knew how they were going to lead that change. And so, I think for our next question, and I know Jamie's really excited about this, we want to know more about that method of change management. So walk us through that soup to nuts from where you were the Focus Plus, multiple microscopes down on every school that you have there, and how you started that transformation in working with University of Delaware, both as an external partnership, as well as some of these investments in curriculum and professional development.
Yeah, well, I will say that one of the first things that we did as a team, we actually spent time studying organizational change. We also, in addition to partnering with the University of Delaware, we also partnered with the University of Virginia through their school transformation program. It's a partnership between the School of Education and the Darden School of Business. And during that partnership, we learned so much about organizational change and change management theory. And the Noster model is something that we really leaned into. And I have really taken that on as a part of everything that I do. I actually have that model hanging up right next to my monitor. And I think about it almost every day. And in the work that I'm doing, how does it fit into that model? Is it part of the vision? Is it part of the skill building? Is it part of am I providing resources, et cetera, et cetera? So that was a really underlying grounding philosophy by, what we were doing. But I will say, and I have to recognize, another thing that was really foundational to the change management was that our superintendent, who had been a former HR director in another place, he recruited the best team of principals that I have ever worked with. He didn't just post the positions and see who would come. He invited and I don't know how he found this team of people, but they were people who had proven success in other schools, and he got them to come to Seaford and take on this monumental challenge. They were the very best people that I have ever worked with. And I think that they made a really big pivotal difference because the leader of the school is at that fulcrum where they're between the community, the teachers, the students, and district office. They're making the change happen. And without the principals, we wouldn't have been able to see the result.
Yeah.
Sorry. So from a leadership perspective, so superintendent sort of brought in, were there any principals who had been there for a while who remained and kind of bought into the process, or was it an entirely new slate of principals?
It was an entirely new slate of principals.
Wow.
Yeah. It took guts. So he moved people who were existing, or he helped them to move on. And he brought on an entirely new team.
Wow.
Yeah.
And because I'm thinking about, if you're a teacher in a school, because I worked in public education, I'm a school psychologist by training, and I spent, a number of years, working in public, inner city, some suburban. And so the idea of leadership change in a school is not one to take lightly, right? There are some folks who I know I worked in a district, and there seemed to be like a 3-year rotation, right? So you come in, you do a little tour in a building, and then you get moved somewhere else. And honestly, like what I found so often is that you had people who'd been there for a bit who would just dig in deeper, right? So this sort of that entrenched mindset and the idea of those leadership shifts would cause them to kind of dig in a little bit harder because they knew like they just had to wait you out, right?
Oh, yeah.
um, so how did maybe talk to us a little bit about how those principles kind of came in and actually sort of like generated some culture that would be sort of positive in a way to kind of help be more conducive to the change.
For sure. Well, all of them had their own styles. For example, let's say one of the principals came to us from the Department of Education, and she was a former principal, had turned around several schools. She went to the Department of Ed, worked in the teacher evaluation work group. So she was super skilled at the teacher evaluation process. And that was her tool to kind of give feedback and drive improvement within her school. We had another principal who developing school culture was really her niche. And she used that model of, have you ever heard of the energy bus? It's a book. And she used that model of the energy bus, and she helped people in her school either get on the bus or get off the bus. We had another principal who was formerly a data coach for Amplify. So, she was a school principal. She left the principalship, went on to go be a data coach, and it was part of that change process. And so her strength was to use data to drive instruction. And she really honed in on that. School level data, classroom based data, student level data, teacher based data. That was what she used as a driver. And then another principal who, there were 4 elementary schools. One of the other one, her specialty was really in the area of school improvement. She was a school improvement coach all over Maryland. And so she really dove into those protocols for collaboration and to really like push the teachers to collaborate towards student success. So, and then not only did each of these principals have their own kind of unique skill set, but we set the environment where they had to collaborate with each other a lot.
That was my next question.
Yeah,
Because I was like, how do you take those 4, like, those 4 different areas of strength and combine to help the whole kind of raise a little bit?
Yeah. So we set up principal PLCs, and we had the principals doing walkthroughs together. We did leadership coaching with them. We brought in partners with the University of Delaware. And I have to say that it all started with Dr. Sharon Walpole's professional learning on the science of reading. Like it was around that time in 2014, 2015. So it was kind of before the science of reading became a really hot topic. Dr. Walpole had written this curriculum called Bookworms, and we were piloting for her. And it was really exciting for me because living in this area that's about 2.5 hours away from the University of Delaware. So we're in Delaware, which is pretty isolated, but we were in southern Delaware, and it was kind of the least desirable part because we're not close to the beach in Seaford. And so our partnership with the University of Delaware was pretty unique. I think Dr. Walpole wanted to like have this be proven in the worst, most lowest achieving district. And that brought all of us together because not only did we get leadership coaching for how to lead schools where the science of reading was the basis for everything that we did, but it also provided the resources for the teachers to not have to spend hours lesson planning. And this was at a time where this new kind of curricula, these HQIM that are so popular now, they're going through ed reports, and that was a totally new concept back then, even. There was a lot of resistance to that kind of curricula because the teachers felt it was scripted and that it was taking away their, you know, ability for creativity. And in order to implement that in a systematic way, we had to collaborate a lot and we had to have our leaders truly on board.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you.
Wow.
I have so many questions from that. Back to your earlier point, I'm thinking about sort of being on fire with the science of reading, right? This idea of kind of finding that push. Like in our work, we've been doing this work for about 50 years. So we've had this kind of this fire in our belly for a long, long time. We've
Yeah.
seen how schools across, because there's probably about 200 schools like ours across the country. Often they're started by parents who've had some really challenging experiences and bring this incredible founder's fire to that conversation, or folks who've had some personal family experiences, or just have a deep compassion for kids and wanted to kind of do some great change work. But this for us has like been something we've been sort of shouting from the rooftops for a long, long, long time. I do think that the tide is finally changing. The reading wars for a second time are hopefully coming to another close here, because I felt like a lot of stuff was really kind of decided post the reading panel.
Mhm.
Like it was like we had some clarity about where the research was and the direction. And so I'm really glad to hear that this is a district that's kind of really kind of picked up in that way. But as we think about sort of the idea of bringing research into the classroom, it is not a straightforward process, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you think about the medical model and going from the lab, the bench to the bedside, as they say, there's a
Yep.
lot of structures built in to help doctors kind of understand, what's the cutting edge, what does it look like in treatment, and what are the outcomes you're hoping to kind of seek. In education, we've had a really hard time, I think, creating some mechanisms to allow that work to kind of flourish. I don't, and this is not a kind of a finger wag at anybody, but I think the incentive models haven't been there, right? So if you're a researcher, you publish a paper, that paper's success depends on how many times it's cited in other papers, right? So it's a system that's kind of feeding a system, versus the success of a research project is, does it get into the hands of teachers to actually let them impact kids in a greater way?
Mm-hmm.
I would argue the latter is a far better metric of success from that standpoint. But talk to us about how you kind of leveraged some of the researchers in the process of this, or maybe the one researcher that you had a really great relationship with, in order to kind of help move this along. How did you bring that kind of him as a consultant to help kind of dig into this work a little bit?
Yeah. So we started with school visits
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
and, just coming in and watching and learning and really getting an idea of what was happening. But we didn't spend a lot of time there.
Yeah.
We brought in and multiple researchers. Besides Dr. Walpole, we also had Dr. Steve Amendum, who was really focused on English learners with me. And then we brought in the new curricula, and we brought Dr. Walpole and her team to come and do professional learning sessions with the teachers. And to be honest with you, at first, we just offered the teachers the opportunity to try.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it was posed in such a way that, listen, let me show you this research. This research has been around for a really long time,
Mm-hmm.
right? And all of the things that are in the science of reading, right? And this isn't anything new, but this isn't currently being applied in the resources that you're using. At that time, we were using, one of those big basal readers. And so we also bought them the resources. We bought them the books.
Mm-hmm.
And the teachers got excited because the kids were going to be able to read entire texts.
Mm.
It was novel and thematic based. And they were super excited because the program that we had, they were only reading excerpts or little short stories that were not real texts by real authors that students could really see. And the teachers get into this because they love teaching.
Mm-hmm.
They love books. They remember all of these experiences of shared reading with their families, and they were read to. And now I really believe that the opportunity to read these books with their students in their classroom was really appealing. I
Mhm.
really think that that was one of the motivators
Mm-hmm.
that teachers were at least willing to try. And then it kind of went off from there. There were lots of problems that happened along the way because the curriculum is hard and it's
Mm-hmm.
aggressive and it's not easy. That's where we leveraged our partnership with the university because we started coaching. We not only partnered for the initial professional learning and access to the curricula, but we also partnered in an ongoing way of coaching from the Professional Development Center at the University of Delaware. And not only did we do coaching where they came in and modeled lessons or taught alongside our teachers, they also started coaching our reading specialists
Mm.
in how to monitor data and how to progress monitor individual students, individual teachers, so that then we could keep getting better and better. Um, our leaders, our principals, assistant principals, grew such a facility with the curricula that they were able to teach alongside their teachers,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that when a teacher was struggling, the school leader could step in and also model. I think that that was really, really powerful because they got into the weeds with the teachers themselves.
Wow.
And we all did.
Yeah. I'm just so struck by everything that you're sharing. And, as you're talking, I'm like, well, what about this? What about this element of scalability and sustainability? And you just talked about it. And so what I'm struck by is this commitment to the change management and the curiosity from your leadership team to ensure that you could map out this journey and this change, right? I thought that was really powerful, to the investment in collaboration and the collective responsibility. And your team guided, it seems like, every stakeholder in that community to take on that responsibility and pair that with the resources so they could be successful. So I love all those pieces that you talked about. In terms of, where you were with the professional development and the coaching, and you talked a little bit more about the problems, were there, I guess, lessons that you could share to principals or school leaders who are in the middle of this transition, whether from a professional learning perspective or from a curriculum transition perspective? Because I could see some of the, school leaders and principals that we're working with right now at the Institute. We do a lot of consulting and outside professional development. So are there any lessons, I think, that you would offer in this moment to say, okay, keep trekking, or think about it this way? What would you say to that?
Yeah. The first thing I would say is that you have to trust the process
Mm.
because it's not clean and it's not pretty. There's setbacks, it's rocky. You'll lose people along the way, but you have to stick with it and you have to find partners and people that are going to believe in it and really kind of help them feed the initiative
Mm.
and kind of stick with it past that.
Right.
The second thing I would say is definitely, and this was pivotal, and I mentioned this before, that we had so many different plans with so many different templates. And they were a 5-year plan, a 3-year plan, all of these, a year-long plan. Actually, what we found to be extremely critical was short cycle planning.
Mm.
How can we create a plan for just 3 months? What can we do in a short amount of time? Name those things that are going to be quick wins, and then execute that plan, and then come back at the end of 3 months, revisit the plan. What were we able to do? What do we need to keep doing? What do we need to stop doing? And then make another plan for the next, 3 months, 4 months or so, right? That was super critical. And then inviting the school leadership team, not just the principal, the assistant principal, but curriculum leads, grade level leads, reading specialists, school counselors, all the different people that impact instruction, climate, you name it, onto the leadership team, really, the critical people, and also people who don't agree with you, into the process, and understanding that short cycle plan so that they not only can have a say in what's in the plan, but they also can see the progress. Feels so good. We all love to check things off.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's motivating for a lot of people. And so that's a big thing. I would also say one of the biggest things that I learned throughout all of my professional learning and is build by borrowing. I really love that phrase because it isn't copying. It's we're going to take something that someone else did, and then we're going to make it our own and fit it to our context, and then make it better.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no shame in that.
Yep.
And then build upon success. Don't spend so much time looking at the ways and the places that things aren't working well and try to fix those. Where is it working and how can you grow that? I really, really dig into that strategy when I am looking at systematic change, because we're never going to change what's in somebody's head.
Yeah.
The only way to change behavior or belief is by showing people that there's a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way to do that, I think, is to find those bright spots and put a spotlight on them. That was one of the really fun things that I did. We started having a lot of success in Seaford, and we kept professional learning going, and we kept those cycles of coaching, and we kept those things. But to be honest with you, I really love challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to open up our schools and open up our classrooms to to be shared on a broader scale. So I made a partnership with the University of Delaware again, but I wanted to do these co-teaching classrooms where a university coach would be in a classroom for many, twice a week over the course of an entire year, and partner with one teacher in each grade level and co-teach with them and really start diving in to on a deeper level, and then using that classroom as a professional learning classroom for other teachers to come in and watch and observe and then debrief. I'm sure you've heard of this kind of a model before.
Yeah.
That was so much fun.
Mm-hmm.
That was a really, really great project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I love all of this. Do you have any final questions for Kelly before I could just keep you on all day. I want to come visit now, But do you have any other final questions?
I love your focus on kind of the process, the short cycle planning. It almost reminds me a little bit of, and with the idea of trusting the process as well. Had a chance to see Roland Good speak a number of years ago, it's almost 20 years ago now. And at Cincinnati Public Schools, he's the guy who helped create DIBELS, like the progress monitoring, fluency-based stuff, right? So Roland is a brilliant man. But he talked about, this idea of we sort of get fluency wrong so often. So he said, fluency is this it's like you're baking brownies. You take the toothpick and you put it in, right? You do a quick check. And he said, so you don't to look at the hole where you put the toothpick in and say, well, it's not done. Then putting a blowtorch on the hole, right? You don't sort of do that. You put it back in the oven And you don't crank it up to 500 either. You kind of let the process run, knowing that you've got the right ingredients for those things to come together, right? You have to have some confidence in what you've got at the table. But the idea of coordinating, and looking at all the components of the big five, your phonemic awareness, your alphabetic principle, your fluency, your vocabulary, your comprehension, and how those things kind of come together in such a big, important way. And the idea of like checking frequently, right? So if you have a year-long plan in the district for a big reading initiative and you wait until the end of the year to kind of see how that plan's going, or to alter that plan, you may be putting sort of like bad foot in front of the other right there, because not having some kind of short cycle check in there, I think, is really important. And then I've just, the idea of the assessment and the planning component of this, like, I think all these things like with the district takeover and trying to kind of have you plan on plan, is like the intention is positive, but it takes away from the work. And it's the same with assessment, right? You have to have just the right amount of planning to do this work. You have to have just the right amount of assessment to do this work. And that is like kind of finding that magical sort of balance point is it's a big challenge in leadership, I would argue, for a lot of schools. But I really appreciate your reflections on that. So.
Yeah, me too. I think just saying, really, there's nothing else I want to echo. I really like how you close that episode. Last question for you, Kelly, because I know we have only a minute left, but what's next for you as your leadership journey? I know you're the chief academic officer at Milford now, which I Google mapped it. It's about like 20 minutes from Seaford. And what's next for Seaford, and what can you leave us with?
Well, let's say in Seaford, I left behind. I think I left behind at a good spot. One of those principals that I was speaking about stepped into my role and has taken that on. And so I'm super excited about seeing where she is going to lead them. And they are really set for success. And I hope that they can continue their success into the secondary schools. So that's where I hope that Seaford is going to go to. And I came to Milford because I'm super excited about trying to replicate. Remember, I want to be Indiana Jones. I want to be on the next frontier. I want to replicate what we did in Seaford with a new team, and kind of, there's some things that I could have done better. So I want to try to do them better here. It also is super fun because in Milford, this is a place where I used to teach. And so I've come back to a district where many of my colleagues we were in the classroom together, they're administrators in, a few different schools across the district. And that has been really phenomenal. And it's really awesome that many of my own students are now teachers in the district, which is super fun. And so I'm seeing the great things that are happening, and I am working to build success. Milford is not at the very bottom, but they're not where they should be. And I want them to really, really demonstrate the greatness that I know that this community can achieve.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Kelly Carvajal Hagemen, thank you so much for being on the Read podcast. Yeah. It's such a joy to learn from you and hear all your insights.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great talking today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was really exciting for me too.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. And if you're ever in New York, come by and say hi. We'd love to show you our program.
I would love to see it.
Yeah, I'd love to continue to learn from each other. So thank you so much. We thank you, readers, for listening to this episode to Lead on Read. To learn more about this episode or from past Read guests, you can visit readpodcast.org. If you are just as inspired from this episode as we are, I invite you to check out further learning opportunities, resources, and articles at thewindwardschool.org/WI. Finally, if you have any ideas of topics and speakers or leaders in the field that are igniting and scaling change, you can reach out to me via email at info@readpodcast.org. And with that, keep leading, readers. Until next time, readers.